intention of leaving, and at the end of the month, after she had received her wages, she packed all her belongings in a handkerchief and started for Pont-l'Évêque. In front of the inn, she met a woman wearing a widow's weeds, and upon questioning her, learned that she was looking for a cook. The girl did not know very much, but appeared so willing and so modest in her requirements that Madame Aubain finally said, "Very well, I will give you a trial." And half an hour later, Félicité was installed in her house. At first, she lived in a constant anxiety that was caused by the style of the household and the memory of Monsieur, that hovered over everything. Paul and Virginia, the one aged 7 and the other barely 4, seemed made of some precious material. She carried them piggyback and was greatly mortified when Madame Aubain forbade her to kiss them every other minute. But in spite of all this, she was happy. The comfort of her new surroundings had obliterated her sadness. Every Thursday, friends of Madame Aubain dropped in for a game of cards, and it was Félicité's duty to prepare the table and heat the foot-warmers. They arrived at exactly 8 o'clock and departed before 11. Every Monday morning, the dealer in second-hand goods, who lived under the alleyway, spread out his wares on the sidewalk. Then the city would be filled with a buzzing of voices in which the neighing of horses, the bleating of lambs, the grunting of pigs could be distinguished, mingled with the sharp sound of wheels on the cobblestones. About 12 o'clock, when the market was in full swing, there appeared at the front door a tall, middle-aged peasant, with a hooked nose and a cap on the back of his head. It was Robelin, the farmer of Jeffosse. Shortly afterwards came Liébard, the farmer of Touques, short, rotund, and ruddy, wearing a grey jacket and spurred boots. Both men brought their landlady either chickens or cheese. Félicité would invariably thwart their ruses, and they held her in great respect. At various times, Madame Aubain received a visit from the Marquis de Grémonville, one of her uncles, who was ruined and lived at Falaise on the remainder of his estates. He always came at dinner-time and brought an ugly poodle with him, whose paws soiled the furniture. In spite of his efforts to appear a man of breeding, he even went so far as to raise his hat every time he said, "My deceased father," his habits got the better of him, and he would fill his glass a little too often and relate broad stories. Félicité would show him out very politely and say, "You have had enough for this time, Monsieur de Grémonville, hoping to see you again," and would close the door. She opened it gladly for Monsieur Bouret, a retired lawyer. His bald head and white cravat, the ruffling of his shirt, his flowing brown coat, the manner in which he took his snuff, his whole person, in fact, produced in her the kind of awe which we feel when we see extraordinary persons. As he managed Madame's estates, he spent hours with her in Monsieur's study. He was in constant fear of being compromised, had a great regard for the magistracy, and some pretensions to learning. In order to facilitate the children's studies, he presented them with an engraved geography, which presented various scenes of the world: cannibals with feather headdresses, a gorilla kidnapping a young girl, Arabs in the desert, a whale being harpooned, etc. Paul explained the pictures to Félicité, and in fact, this was her only literary education. The children's studies were under the direction of a poor devil employed at the town hall, who sharpened his pocket-knife on his boots and was famous for his penmanship. When the weather was fine, they went to Jeffosse. The house was built in the centre of the sloping yard, and the sea looked like a grey spot in the distance. Félicité would take slices of cold meat from the lunch basket, and they would sit down and eat in a room next to the dairy. This room was all that remained of a cottage that had been torn down. The dilapidated wallpaper trembled in the draughts. Madame Aubain, overwhelmed by recollections, would hang her head, while the children were afraid to open their mouths. Then, "Why don't you go and play?" their mother would say, and they would scamper off. Paul would go to the old barn, catch birds, throw stones into the pond, or pound the trunks of the trees with a stick till they resounded like drums. Virginia would feed the rabbits and run to pick the wild flowers in the fields, and her flying legs would disclose her little embroidered pantalettes. One autumn evening they struck out for home through the meadows. The new moon illumined part of the sky, and a mist hovered like a veil over the sinuosities of the river. Oxen, lying in the pastures, gazed mildly at the passing persons. In the third field, however, several of them got up and surrounded them. "Don't be afraid," cried Félicité, and murmuring a sort of lament, she passed her hand over the back of the nearest ox. He turned away, and the others followed. But when they came to the next pasture, they heard frightful bellowing. It was a bull, which was hidden from them by the fog. He advanced towards the two women, and Madame Aubain prepared to flee for her life. "No, no, not so fast," warned Félicité. Still they hurried on, for they could hear the noisy breathing of the bull close behind them. His hoofs pounded the grass like hammers, and presently he began to gallop. Félicité turned round and threw patches of grass in his eyes. He hung his head, shook his horns, and bellowed with fury. Madame Aubain and the children, huddled at the end of the field, were trying to jump over the ditch. Félicité continued to back before the bull, blinding him with dirt, while she shouted to them to make haste. Madame Aubain finally slid into the ditch, after shoving first Virginia and then Paul into it, and though she stumbled several times, she managed, by dint of courage, to climb the other side of it. The bull had driven Félicité up against a fence. The foam from his muzzle flew in her face, and in another minute he would have disembowelled her. She had just time to slip between two bars, and the huge animal, thwarted, paused. For years this occurrence was a topic of conversation in Pont-l'Évêque, but Félicité took no credit to herself, and probably never knew that she had been heroic. Virginia occupied her thoughts solely, for the shock she had sustained gave her a nervous affection, and the physician, M. Poupart, prescribed the salt-water bathing at Trouville. In those days Trouville was not greatly patronized. Madame Aubain gathered information, consulted Bouret, and made preparations as if they were going on an extended trip. The baggage was sent the day before in Liébard's cart. On the following morning he brought around 2 horses, one of which had a woman's saddle with a velveteen back to it, while on the crupper of the other was a rolled shawl that was to be used for a seat. Madame Aubain mounted the second horse, behind Liébard. Félicité took charge of the little girl, and Paul rode Monsieur Le Chapetois' donkey, which had been lent for the occasion on the condition that they should be careful of it. The road was so bad that it took 2 hours to cover the 8 miles. The 2 horses sank knee-deep into the mud and stumbled into ditches. Sometimes they had to jump over them. In certain places, Liébard's mare stopped abruptly. He waited patiently till she started again, and talked of the people whose estates bordered the road, adding his own moral reflections to the outline of their histories. Thus, when they were passing through Touques, and came to some windows draped with nasturtiums, he shrugged his shoulders and said, "There's a woman, Madame Lahoussaye, who, instead of taking a young man—" Félicité could not catch what followed. The horses began to trot, the donkey to gallop, and they turned into a lane. Then a gate swung open. 2 farmhands appeared, and they all dismounted at the very threshold of the farmhouse. Mother Liébard, when she caught sight of her mistress, was lavish with joyful demonstrations. She got up a lunch which comprised a leg of mutton, tripe, sausages, a chicken fricassee, sweet cider, a fruit